so we're going to talk about The Traffic in Women, Notes on the Political Economy of Sex by Gail Rubin. So what's happening in this article? What is Rubin up to? Her main project here is going to be to figure out what is at the root of women's oppression. She's going to try to answer this question by using discourses from Marxism, psychoanalysis, and kinship theories. So you can see she's pulling ideas from a lot of different places to try to answer her question. So I don't want you to get wrapped up in when things get a little bit complicated. So let's start by looking at the basics of some of the theoretical stuff Rubin uses. I'm going to run through the basics of Marxism and kinship first, and then I'll go into how she uses them in a second. So Marxism is a political theory that says that our social relationships are centered around capitalism. This is going to mean that we all function by working to exchange capital, and that's going to take shape in things, products, labor, or even people. So here I want you to think about labor and production because it's a really easy example of how the exchange of capital works. So say a person works at a factory and their human capital turns into the production of some commodity or product through their labor. Then that product goes to market and is sold for a certain dollar amount. The laborer is going to make a wage from his or her labor and then is going to spend that money at the market to buy some other goods that have been produced in similar ways. So these processes, from the worker to the product to the money, are all exchanges of capital. An important part of Marxism for Rubin is that people serve as capital also. So the worker that works at the factory is a form of capital because his or her labor creates some product that ends up selling for money. But a factory worker isn't the only way a person can be a mode of production or a capital. By reproducing, women serve as capital because they're making more people who will become these sort of cogs in the capital machine, so to speak. But that's not the only way women serve as capital. They also reproduce the patriarchy by serving in their roles by producing more people and laboring in the home for free. So the woman's role supports or legitimates the fact that the world revolves around men who are going to labor for the exchange of money. This is because while the men are out, women are taking care of all the free labor at home and in childbearing. So now you know a tiny bit about Marxism. Let's look at kinship for a second. So kinship is how our families are formed, like what you see in the family tree diagram here on the right. It served as the way early societies were formed. So I'm talking here about what you would think of as biblical times or small societies formed a really long time ago, when family ties were a way that people were connected through farming or business or what have you. The important thing to know here is that kinship ties serve to dictate who is going to interact or work together in certain ways. So you could think here about arranged marriages as a way that families create ties or bonds with each other by marrying their children. Now these kinship ties are usually centered around sex or gender, and Rubin supports this by talking about ways taboos solidify the relationships between men and women, thus creating and perpetuating heterosexual marriage norms. I'll get to the specific taboos in a second and explain how they function. Okay, so then let's put what we know about Marxism and kinship together so far. The importance here is that kinship structures and goals for capital focus around these small units of production. These units always involve one man and one woman, ideally. This is where gender roles come into play, because gender roles assume that there's a natural separation between what men and women can do, so they're dependent on each other. So the roles of men and women complement each other to create this unit for capital. The important thing to note here is that Rubin is highlighting that these gender roles are not natural, but they're created to make this mutual reliance. These roles are also centered around reproduction, which makes sense from what we know about Marxism and that creating more people is a way of producing more capital. So why do we normally assume that these roles are natural and not socially prescribed? Because we're told that certain behaviors that lie outside of the norm of heterosexual units are wrong. So examples of these might be homosexuality taboos, And that's going to be because two properly behaving women, according to their gender norms, can't function as a unit, and because they can't reproduce. Another taboo would be of women working outside their roles, because that means their function of providing child rearing and free labor would be compromised. And last, incest would mean that a family couldn't spread their connections to other families, and that the relationships that make up societies would be compromised. So you might be thinking at this point that Rubin is not clear on how this specifically hurts women and isn't just talking about how it's restrictive to everyone. But the point she makes is that because women are traded between men for the sake of creating new kinship ties, it means that they become commodities. And by commodity, I mean that they're turned into things that are exchanged. So you can see this with the idea of dowries, where a woman's family saves up money or things to give to the groom so that he can take her. This whole situation is harmful to women then because they no longer have control or ownership over themselves. This means that men have power over women according to kinship norms. So finally, we're going to follow up with some information on psychoanalysis that Rubin talks about. I told you this would get a little complicated. So psychoanalysis for Rubin serves to further solidify the idea that heterosexuality is normal and natural. You can see this with the infamous Oedipal complex that sexualizes children and reinforces incest taboos and homosexuality taboos. This is also going to make the oppression or subordination of women seem natural. So this can be shown with the other infamous penis envy that all adolescent women are said to experience. All right, so that's the gist of what Rubin uses. So what's the takeaway from all this? The point is that we need to change the ways we think about kinship if feminists are ever going to get anywhere. And part of that change is going to involve looking at the sex-gender system as something that isn't natural or biological, but is something that's been put into place socio-historically to organize us in certain ways. So now you're going to read Rubin from the Feminist Philosophy Reader, and you're going to complete the guided reading quiz questions for the reading. And remember, again, that you can always go to the help forum, and if at any point you get confused, you can ask your classmates and me for advice on some part of the Rubin piece. Good luck!